Back in 2018, I used to work at the Burger King near my college. This helped me pay off my college debt and helped me financially as well. While working there, this was the creepiest thing I ever experienced. It happened during one of my closing shifts. Our store closed at 10 p.m., and usually the early evening hours were busy, but the last couple of hours were slow. Around 8:30 p.m., a man walked in. He was tall, over 6 feet, and wore a baseball cap. I stood behind the counter, ready to take his order, but instead of approaching me, he went to the back of the restaurant and sat down in a booth. I figured he was waiting for someone or something like that. For the next 30 minutes or so, I noticed the man frequently looking up at me from his booth. He seemed creepy, and I got a weird vibe from him. At the time, I was working with just 2 other people, my coworkers Jen and Michael, but overall, I felt safe, and I wasn't too worried. Over the final hour, a few more customers came in, but finally, at about 9:55 p.m., it was time to start closing up. I began mopping the floors and cleaning the seating area. Michael went home and Jen worked on cleaning up in the back. As I mopped under one of the booths, I thought I heard a noise coming from behind a nearby garbage can. When I looked, I saw a shoe sticking out from the side. My heart started racing, and I quickly went back to the counter to tell Jen what I saw. She was in the kitchen and suggested I ask the man to leave, and if he didn't, I should call the police. Though uncomfortable knowing someone was hiding behind a garbage can, I knew I had to do something. When I walked back out from the kitchen and past the counter, I heard a noise to my right. As I turned my head, I saw the man running towards me. He grabbed my neck and put me in some kind of headlock. I screamed, but he covered my mouth. He led me behind the register and demanded all the money. He opened the registers and started taking out the cash, all while keeping me under his control. He got away with about $200 before saying he needed to leave. We walked out the door together, and he warned me not to go back inside and call the police. Finally, he released me and ran to his car, driving away. As I walked back inside, I heard sirens outside. Jen came running out asking if I was okay. She had hidden in the back and called the police as soon as she heard what was happening. We spoke to the police, and about an hour later, they caught the man. It was a terrifying experience, but thankfully we were both safe. When the police investigated, they found the man to be mentally sick. Turns out he was a psycho. It was a late night, a few months back, when I found myself driving home from work. Sometimes my shifts ran really long, and on this particular night, I didn't leave until around 9 or 10 p.m. As I drove down the road, I felt really hungry since I skipped my lunch at work too, and my eyes lit up when I spotted a Burger King. Without even checking if they were open, I veered into the parking lot and pulled up to the drive-thru. There was already a car in front of me, placing their order, and another car had pulled in behind me. I waited patiently for a minute or so, but the car in front of me seemed to be taking forever. I glanced around and noticed that most of the lights in the restaurant were off. It seemed odd, but I figured they were probably just closing up for the night. Just as I was about to drive away, I realized that both the car in front of me and the one behind me had boxed me in. The drive-through lane was narrow, with just enough space for one car, and the restaurant was on one side while bushes and trees lined the other. I considered getting out of my truck to let the other drivers know that the Burger King was closed, but I hesitated. How could they not figure it out for themselves? As I was pondering my next move, I heard a man shout something. My attention snapped back to the cars in front and behind me. 2 men had exited the car in front, and 2 more emerged from the vehicle behind me. They were all speaking in a language I couldn't understand. My heart began to race as they approached my truck. One man went to each door, and when they reached the windows, one of them looked at me and demanded that I get out of my car. I was confused and asked them what they wanted, but they just repeated their demand. When the men at my rear doors tried to open them, panic started to set in. I yelled at them to leave me alone, but they didn't listen. As one of them hit the window, I knew I had to get out of there. Without hesitation, I put my car in reverse and backed up as far as I could. Unfortunately, I only managed to go about 2 feet before bumping into the car behind me. Thinking quickly, I turned the wheel and drove up onto the curb, crashing through the bushes in the process. The sound of crunching branches filled the air as I maneuvered my truck into the parking lot of a nearby bank. Once I was back on the highway, I breathed a sigh of relief, thankful to have escaped whatever those men were up to. To this day, I still don't know what they wanted, but I have a feeling it wasn't anything good. This happened back in 2017. It was during a road trip to visit some national parks that my boyfriend and I decided to stop at a Burger King one night. We were both pretty hungry, so we figured we'd grab a quick bite before hitting the road again. When we got inside, my boyfriend mentioned he needed to use the bathroom, so I told him I'd go ahead and order the food for us. The woman at the counter seemed a bit off to me, but I brushed it off. I mean, late-night fast food joints always have a strange vibe, right? After placing our order, I sat down to wait for my boyfriend to come back. But as the minutes ticked by, he still hadn't returned. I started to get a little worried and decided to check on him. Walking down the hallway towards the men's bathroom, I noticed a sliver of light peeking out from under the door. I knocked lightly, but there was no response. When the door finally swung open, my boyfriend stepped out, looking completely out of it. I asked him why he didn't answer when I knocked, but he just brushed past me, his eyes glazed over. I could tell something wasn't right. Then I noticed he was holding a piece of broken mirror in his hand. Before I could even react, he suddenly lunged towards me, his eyes fixed on the old woman behind the counter. I panicked and grabbed his hand, managing to knock the shard out of his grasp. In the heat of the moment, I lightly tapped the side of his head to snap him out of whatever trance he was in. It worked, and he seemed to come to his senses, looking confused and asking what had happened. Meanwhile, the woman behind the counter had darted off into the kitchen, disappearing from sight. I couldn't shake the feeling that something wasn't right, so I decided to check out the bathroom to see if anything strange had happened in there. As I pushed open the door, I was greeted by the sight of an old box TV playing a bizarre video with strange shapes flashing across the screen. Feeling unnerved, I quickly left the bathroom and told my boyfriend it was time to go. As we drove away, I couldn't shake the feeling that the woman at the Burger King had something to do with my boyfriend's strange behavior. We couldn't figure out why she had run off or what was up with the weird video playing in the bathroom. The rest of the drive that night, we were both on edge, paranoid that something even stranger might happen, or that the woman might try to follow us. It was definitely a night we won't forget anytime soon. As I sat in Burger King enjoying my burger and soda, a strange man walked in. He was tall and thin, with a long trench coat that he seemed to shiver under. From the network of veins on the back of his hands, I could tell he was very lean. His long, thin hair fell loosely on his face, and his sunken cheeks gave him an unmistakably somber appearance. Something about him felt off, and I couldn't help but watch as he made his way to a seat. He ambled slowly, hunched over at the shoulders, his movements seeming almost mechanical. As he sat down, he kept his hands on the table, and I noticed the bleach-white skin of his face had a slight pink discoloration around his nose and mouth. His eyes were a dizzy gray pair that stared blankly ahead, not really focusing on anything in particular. I watched him for a moment, intrigued by his strange demeanor. Despite the warm weather outside, he seemed to be shivering, though I wouldn't have assumed he was so frail as to be incapable of supporting his own weight. I swallowed the piece of food in my mouth, my gaze fixed on the man. I had no other form of entertainment for the moment, and I found him rather curious. He seemed lost in his own thoughts, his eyes distant and unfocused. The girl behind the counter approached him, her round face plastered with the same insincere smile I had seen on many fast food workers. "Hello, what's your order?" she asked, her tone polite but lacking genuine warmth. The man turned away from me and faced the counter, his back to me as he spoke to the girl. I strained to hear their conversation, but the man's voice was barely audible from where I was seated. The girl seemed to be having trouble understanding him, her frustration evident in the way her smile faltered. I wondered what they were discussing and briefly considered eavesdropping, but I decided against it, not wanting to intrude on their conversation. Instead, I focused on my food, taking another bite of my burger and washing it down with a sip of soda. As I ate, I couldn't shake the feeling that something was off about the man. His behavior seemed erratic, and there was an air of tension surrounding him. I couldn't quite put my finger on it, but I couldn't shake the feeling that something was about to go wrong. Suddenly, the man turned to me, his gaze piercing as he locked eyes with mine. His mouth moved, but I couldn't make out what he was saying. I frowned, trying to decipher his words, but they were lost in the ambient noise of the restaurant. "Can you speak up?" I asked, puzzled by his behavior. But before he could respond, he reached into his coat and pulled out a steel cleaver with a curved handle. My heart skipped a beat as I realized what was happening. Panic surged through me as I realized the danger we were in. I looked around frantically, searching for an exit or something I could use to defend myself. But before I could react, the man lunged forward, his eyes wild with madness. I stumbled backward, my chair tipping over as I scrambled to get away from him. The girl behind the counter screamed, and chaos erupted in the restaurant as patrons fled in all directions. Instinct kicked in and I reached for my gun, drawing it from its holster as I took aim at the man. "Drop the weapon!" I shouted, my voice shaking with adrenaline. But the man ignored my command, his gaze fixed on his target as he raised the cleaver high above his head. I knew I had to act fast, or he would strike again. With a steady hand, I squeezed the trigger, the gunshot echoing loudly in the confined space of the restaurant. The man staggered backward, the cleaver slipping from his grasp as he fell to the ground. I approached cautiously, my gun still trained on him as I assessed the situation. Blood pooled around him, staining the linoleum floor as he lay motionless on the ground. I felt a surge of relief wash over me as I realized the threat had been neutralized. But the adrenaline coursing through my veins left me feeling shaky and disoriented. The girl behind the counter emerged from her hiding place, her eyes wide with fear as she surveyed the scene before her. "Is he?" she began, her voice trembling. I nodded, holstering my gun as I took a deep breath to steady myself. "He's down," I said, my voice hoarse with emotion. "It's over." We waited together in tense silence as the sounds of sirens grew louder in the distance. Soon, the police would arrive to take control of the situation, but for now, we were alone in the aftermath of the chaos. As I looked around at the wreckage of the restaurant, I couldn't help but wonder what had driven the man to such madness. Had he been a victim of circumstance, driven to desperation by forces beyond his control? Or had he been consumed by his own inner demons, unable to escape the darkness that lurked within? I may never know the answers to these questions, but one thing was certain. On that fateful day in Burger King, I had come face to face with the darkest aspects of human nature, and it was a confrontation I would not soon forget. When Aaron asked me out to dinner a few nights ago, I was excited, assuming we'd be going to a nice restaurant. But my hopes were dashed when he pulled into the Burger King parking lot. Still, I didn't mind too much. I loved burgers, and I loved Aaron even more. Any time spent with him was fine by me. However, as soon as we got our food, I noticed something was off. Aaron seemed distant, avoiding eye contact and fumbling with his food. I started to worry that he was going to break up with me. And then he said those dreaded 4 words, "We need to talk." My heart sank. I braced myself for the worst. On one hand, I was shocked. I thought we were happy together. On the other hand, I understood some of Aaron's issues. He struggled to hold down a job, while I was the one making enough money for both of us. I reassured him that I didn't mind, but maybe he did. Finally, Aaron mustered up the courage to speak. He confessed that he was in trouble. He had been gambling, borrowing money he couldn't repay, and now shady people were after him. My mind raced as I tried to process what he was saying. "What does that mean?" I asked, my voice trembling. "It means I'm in danger," he replied, his eyes filled with fear. "And I need your help." I was speechless. Not only had Aaron gotten mixed up in illegal gambling, but he had also used my identity as a cover. I couldn't believe it. We had been together for 3 years, and I had no idea he was capable of such betrayal. Before I could respond, Aaron spotted something outside the window. A black van had parked outside, and 3 large men were approaching the restaurant, each holding a crowbar. My heart raced as I realized they were the people Aaron had been afraid of. "It's okay," Aaron reassured me. "They just want to break a kneecap. Let them do it, and then you can pay them." I was horrified by his words. How could he expect me to go along with this? But as the men entered the restaurant, I knew I had to make a decision. I could either admit who I was and accept the pain, or I could fight back. In that moment, fueled by anger and fear, I chose to fight. I pushed myself out of the booth, grabbed a crowbar, and prepared to defend myself. The men were taken aback by my sudden resistance, but they quickly regrouped and advanced toward me. I knew I couldn't take them on alone, so I came up with a plan. I pretended to surrender, but instead, I pleaded with them to spare Aaron and take me instead. I begged them to leave him alone, emphasizing how much he meant to me. To my relief, the men seemed to buy my act. They turned their attention to Aaron, leaving him beaten and bruised in the booth. As they walked away, one of them warned me not to bring my boyfriend into situations like this again. I watched in horror as they left, knowing that I had narrowly escaped a dangerous situation. Aaron lay slumped in the booth, his eyes filled with pain and regret. I couldn't bring myself to look at him. As I helped Aaron out of the restaurant and into the car, I couldn't help but feel a sense of betrayal. I had trusted him, and he had put both of our lives in danger. But as we drove away from the Burger King, I knew that our relationship would never be the same, and I wondered if we would ever be able to recover from this ordeal.